Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis? I'm alive. I'm here. I've just been going through this prosecution opening and trying to put it in some chronological order, literally since 5 o'clock. I've watched it twice, y'all. I've taken 2 for the team. What a hot mess express that was today. But first, I want to give a big thank you to my girl Dawn for the very generous PayPal donation. Thank you super, super much. Very kind of you. So I hope you know everybody in this case because you're going to be really lost in this series. If not, Fruit Loop, right before she left, reposted our 4 or 5 part series on this case where we break down who everybody is. If you're more visual, there are some documentaries out there that explain everything. So, anyways, man, they said today 6 to 8 week trial. We're going to get to the prosecution openings in just a second. But first, music fact of the day. Purple Rain was originally written as a country song and was intended to be a collaboration with Fleetwood Mac singer Stevie Nicks. Nicks said she received a 10-minute instrumental version of the song from Prince with a request for her to write the lyrics, and she felt just super overwhelmed by the task. She said, I listened to it and I just got scared. I called him back and said, I can't do it. I wish I could. It's too much for me. So then Prince asked his backing band to try to play the song. He said he wanted to try this song really mellow before he went home. And so it took out the country feeling and came into the version that we know and love today. And they played it for 6 hours. And by the end of that day, they mostly had everything done and arranged. All right. So you notice things are a little different on my presentation here. I'm not done. I really thought that I would have more time before I had to go on. I didn't realize I was going down like this prosecution rabbit hole. So let's get to it. First of all, this trial, originally they said 30 days. I said, no way. Have to give a big shout out to Big E on Twitter, Chasing Paper. He was front row today. He got to go. So I'm really happy Big E got to go. So, 30 days originally. Now it's 6 to 8 week trial. This prosecutor, okay, so I'm definitely not making fun of her. Nerves get the best of you. This is the biggest criminal case in Ohio history. The world is watching, and I get the nerves, but you've had this case for 6 years. Like, you shouldn't need your notes, guys. She was so nervous. She jumped back and forth between things, and she couldn't tell how many gunshot wounds some of these victims had. She mixed up some of the caliber casings that they found at Chris Sr.'s house. Kenneth, they all had these different slides that she put on there. Kenneth didn't get one. His was just left out. I mean, look, this is too big, way too big of a case for her not to just have it down pat, y'all. I mean, this is going to be super bad if this is kind of setting the bar for what we can expect. So on Hannah May's slide, they were listed as the son of Chris and Dana Rhoden. She's got to get it together. It was long. And I'm going to tell you right now, if I got confused and I followed this case for 6 years, I literally at times was like, I don't know what the heck she's talking about. And I mean, this is all stuff that those of us that have followed it know it inside and out. I cannot imagine those jurors. Bless it. They probably went home with like, I have no clue. It's bad when the defense comes in and does a very short and clean opening. Man. Oh, okay. So enough about all that. So the prosecution, I have reworked everything, y'all. I have taken what she did today and I have put it into a master timeline, kind of like the Valo Daybell series. And that's what's taken me so long because I had to verify things. So She says, "We're here because this family on April 21st through the early morning hours of the 22nd, in 2016 went to Union Hill Road and murdered 8 people. There was 3 months of planning, plotting, purchasing, and preparing." So, okay, this is where I'm taking the reins, and I'm gonna say we're gonna explain some things first. All right, before we get into Jake and Hannah Mae, who are kind of the center of this case, let's go ahead and talk about George and his wife, Tabitha, who the defense attorney calls Tabby. So I don't know what to call her now. I don't know what my name is right now. It's almost 11. So George and Tabitha were married in 2012, and she lived with the Wagners after they were married. She wasn't allowed to contact her family for over a year because the Wagners didn't think her family were good people. She grew up in an abusive home, and they didn't want her in contact. She was allowed to call her mom on Mother's Day, but they were standing right there listening to every word. I could never live like that. The Wagners also accused Tabitha of poisoning their food, being abusive to hers and George's child. They were critical of her parenting and said she should parent like Angela. On one occasion, George and Tabitha got into an argument, and Tabitha said she would take their child and leave. So Angela took the child and said she was going to get her gun. And as Tabitha was leaving through the door, Angela just chucked a 2x4 at her. Tabitha hid on that property until it was dark and then got a bike and rode to a gas station. So the Wagners go looking for her and they find her. And they were worried she might call the police, but actually she was just calling her mom. So the Wagners said whoever calls authorities first is the one who gets the charges, and tells George to call alleging domestic violence. And with all 3 of them against supporting George's version against Tabitha, the complaint was filed against her. So they eventually have a dissolution of their marriage, and custody is discussed in the hearing. And she did not have representation. George did have an attorney, and she entered into what the prosecution said was the worst custody agreement ever. George had full custody, and Tabitha could only see their child when the Wagner said so, and also when they were there with her and that child. So Tabitha will testify that the Wagners convinced her this was temporary until she could get her on place and get on her own 2 feet. When she did get settled, they didn't permit any more visitation. She did get an attorney in 2015, and this is where the prosecutor doesn't finish. So maybe Tabitha will tell us on the stand. She said the controlling nature was the same with Hannah Mae, Tabitha, and eventually Jake's wife from Alaska after the murders. Her name was Beth Ann. We'll get to that later. So she said this starts with a love story. I don't know how you say that at 13 and 18, but que sera. So Hannah and Jake met when Hannah was 13 and she was at the fairgrounds. She was in 4-H club, which I believe is like Future Farmers of America. It's for farmers and like country stuff, I think. I think it's really cool things. We had Future Farmers of America at our school, but I think 4-H is kind of similar. Someone introduced her to Jake, who was almost 18 at the time, and Jake said initially he was really annoyed by her, but a chance second meeting went better, and they started dating in August of 2010. So Jake gets permission from Chris Sr. to date Hannah, and he says, yes, you can date her, but he would send a chaperone along on their dates. So it was either Frankie or little Chris. And also, Chris Sr. and Billy were friends. So because of that reason, he gave Jake permission to date Hannah at such a young age. So a few years later, Jake asked Chris Sr. if he could propose to Hannah. And Chris Sr. said yes, but she's not marrying anybody until she's 18. So Jake and Hannah Mae each got wedding rings tattooed on their finger. When Jake testifies, if he allows himself to be seen on camera, you can still see it. Hannah got pregnant by Jake at the age of 15. Jake was 20. So during her pregnancy is when trouble started between her and Jake. Texts from Jake to Hannah say that she has to make a decision either to live with him or not. But unborn Sophia would live with him no matter what. And in one text, he says, I'll take Sophia, if I had to, by force. I mean, this is while Hannah's still pregnant with the kid pregnant with the kid. So she gives birth to their first child, Sophia, in 2013, and periodically stayed over with the Wagners. And then the Wagners moved over to Peterson Road. You're going to hear that a lot throughout this trial. This is where they were living. The Wagners were living when they committed the murders. So Hannah lived with the Wagners there on Peterson Road. However, Billy Wagner, the dad, did not live there. Instead, he lived with his mom, Frederica, at Flying W Farms. Also, Tabitha, George the Fourth's wife, she lived there with them as well for some time. So let's see where we're at here, guys. I know a lot of you too said, I'm the same way when I'm kind of watching something. If you didn't get to watch today, I will tell you that the prosecutor said a lot, and that is an ear sore on people. I know a lot of people complained about that throughout the thing. I don't know. It's just she was so confused. She didn't know yeah, dude, seriously, I could have done a better job. And I'm not tooting my own horn. It was Hot Mess Express. So, anyways, I was trying to find a picture of both families together at George's wedding, but I'm sorry I didn't upload it. So Hannah leaves Jake in early 2015, and she calls her dad, Chris Sr., and says to come pick her up. She said Jake had choked her, and she couldn't handle how controlling that family was. Also, when she lived there, Jake wanted Angela to parent Sophia and for Sophia to call Angela mom. Hannah said she was fat shamed. The Wagners kept her from her family. And once Hannah left, she started dating Charlie Gilley. Now, he is the brother of victim Hannah Gilley, who was murdered there with Frankie Rhoden. Hannah said that Charlie had an addiction problem and he was struggling with that, so she couldn't date him. And she started dating another guy named Corey Holdren. And that's when she learned she was pregnant with her second child. And there wasn't a question. She knew the baby was Charlie's. But Corey did stay with her anyway. He had an addiction to pills, but she was instrumental in helping him get off of those. But at the same time, you have Jake continuously trying to get back together with Hannah. And he goes to an attorney to get full custody of Sophia. Hannah meets with Jake's attorneys, and she's just not willing to sign over custody. When the Wagners learned Hannah was pregnant again, they put that struggle for custody aside. On December 9th, 2015, Hannah was having a Facebook Messenger conversation with Tabitha's mom, Tess, about the custody issue. So remember, Tabitha signed over this custody kind of on false pretenses. Get back on your feet. We can work something out. And Tess told Hannah, don't let them make you sign papers like they did to Tabitha. Hannah said, I won't sign papers ever. They'll have to kill me first. So Angela had been hacking into Tabitha and Tess's social media, and she sees the message almost in real time from what they're saying and takes a screenshot of that message. They'll have to kill me. And it was almost immediately after the message was sent. They think she might have been actively monitoring her, meaning watching the conversation as it's being made. Also, to be noted, Tabitha was forced to give the Wagners her passwords when she lived there, and she didn't change them when she left. I guess you just don't think about stuff like that. That message is really what set their plan into motion to murder the whole family, according to Jake in his confession. So the planning started a month later in January of 2016. He said in his confession that his attorney told him he likely would not get custody of Sophia because him and Hannah Mae were not married. And in Ohio, when a couple is not married, the courts tend to favor the mother for full custody. So Jake said he knew he had to kill her and her family. 4 months later, of course, Hannah and 7 other people in her family were dead. So when Jake told his story, the prosecution said, we were right about most of it. Jake said the idea to kill the Rhodens was not his. His dad, Billy, first approached him with the idea. He admitted he was a willing participant, and the reason for the murders was the Wagners believed Hannah was dating people they didn't approve of and letting Sophia be around people who weren't good. They believe Hannah had been sexually abused by a peer-aged friend of the family, and that worried them about Sophia. Initially, Jake said no to the idea of murdering Hannah Mae. So he said he thought about it and didn't think anything had happened to Sophia, but why wait on something to happen? So at first, the plan was just to murder Hannah Mae and then Corey, but set it up to where it looked like a murder suicide. But Billy didn't think that would work. At one point, Angela said they should just rat out Chris Sr. for having this growing weed operation on his property and maybe, send him to prison, and that would break down the family a bit. But Billy said he couldn't do that to his best friend. Okay, let's not send him to prison, but let's shoot him like 6 times in the face. Lord have mercy, these people. The initial plan was to kill Chris Sr., Dana, Frankie, Hannah Mae, and little Chris. Kenneth was added on after they had their main targets. And Jake will tell you they knew there may be other people there in those residences the nights of the murder, and they were okay with killing them too. In fact, little Chris frequently had friends sleep over on the couch. But just so happened the night of the murder, little Chris was on restrictions for breaking curfew, and his mom had taken his car keys, and his friend didn't spend the night, thank goodness. So between February and March of 2016, they made purchases for the murder, including 2 mag light flashlights. These can be used to make silencers. They're the long metal flashlights, kind of skinny. Think about a silencer and then think about a flashlight. That's what they were buying. They had, let's see, mag lights also have serial numbers, by the way. That may come in because she said that. Financials also showed purchases for drill bits, what they call tap and die sets, which are tools used to create screw threads, which is called threading, and freeze plugs, which is normally a car part that protects engines from cold-related damage, but that also can be used to make homemade suppressors. They also bought brass catchers, which catches the cartridge or the casing as it's ejected so you don't leave it at the scene, and bait net. They found that Jake used his rewards cards to buy ammo and magazines for SKS guns in April. A phone jammer was bought by Angela, and what it does, it jams phone signals. It's illegal because it can actually mess with aircraft. So those are illegal. And a bug detector, that's a radio frequency detector, and that can locate and identify hidden cameras by detecting the frequency emissions, and it can detect like the most hidden cameras that your eye's not going to see. Angela bought the boys Velcro shoes from Walmart and got them in different sizes than they normally wore. And she also said it's the kind they would never be caught dead in. It's not a good play on words, Angela. March 17th, 2006, the boys buy DVRs for surveillance at their house, and Billy scolds them after the murders and makes them burn them. They're later found in a burn pit by law enforcement. What he didn't want was for them to see them coming and going on the night of the murder or destroying evidence. So, Jake would take videos when he would drop off Sophia with her mom, Hannah. And also he would ask about the locks on Frankie's house. And this was about a week before the murder. And Jake was a really big Walking Dead fan. And they showed a picture, and I'm going to put it on stream here, of a gun. Wait, is that the wrong picture? No. Actually, yes, that's the wrong picture. Sorry, y'all. But they do show a picture. I'll upload it and put it in the link in the description. Sorry, y'all. It's very late. And I'm just really like hanging by a thread. Just want to get through this. So he was obsessed with The Walking Dead, and they show a picture of a character holding a gun that they say Jake took a lot of cues from when he was making his silencer. So April 9th, 2016, George buys 2 ski masks, April 16th, 2016, the custody documents giving Angela sole custody of both Jake and George's children, should something happen to them, were printed on that computer. They were dated for March 15th. They were backdated. Also, they had another set of documents where Hannah Mae's name was forged, and it was dated on Christmas Eve 2014, which was the last holiday she actually spent with the Wagners. And it said, "If I die, I want my child to go to Jake." Now, Angela's mom gets pulled into this. Rita Newcomb, she was arrested for forgery after Angela asked her to lie and say Hannah Mae was present when the documents were signed, and also wanted her mom to lie and say that she notarized that paper. So Rita came clean with investigators after a while and said Angela asked her to lie to investigators. So they dropped those charges down from felony to misdemeanor. She still has not been sentenced yet either. April 18th, George buys fuel filters at an auto store. This is something also that can be used to make homemade silencers that's meant for a car. She says Jake will admit he purchased a truck specifically for the murders. His dad, Billy, overheard his uncle say he was selling his truck for $2,500. Billy says, "We'll take it." So Jake, George, and Angela came and paid for it. And they modified that truck. They built a false bed with 2x4s, put some eye hooks on there, and put hay on top of that to make it look like the bed of the truck was full of hay. And there's a space underneath where that fake little false bed is. Earlier in the week before the murders, Jake and George dye their hair dark. And the prosecution says this is to try and make themselves look like characters from Jake's favorite movie, The Boondock Saints. We'll talk about that in just a second. Hannah Mae had been asking for a crib that was Sophia's for her new baby. And Jake had been putting it off, but finally brought it to her and assembled it the week of the murders. Totally think that was to scope stuff out. If she needed the crib, I mean, the baby was 5 days old. So it seems to me like, he could have done it before. Yeah, he's probably just scoping things out. Also, Billy had made plans for a very lucrative drug deal out of California with Chris Sr. that he said was worth $800,000. So this is why Chris Sr. was expecting Billy that night, and it wasn't a surprise. And Chris Sr. had a marijuana grow operation on his property. Kenneth did as well, just not as big. So we get to the night of the murders, April 21st into the 22nd of 2016. So the night and early morning hours, they leave their phone at home with Angela and told her to text people or to use the phone to make it look like they were home at the time of the murders. They noted that this is the first time in 2016 that Billy's phone was at Peterson Road, like before bed, during the night, and the next morning. Before they leave, Jake said he and George watched a clip from the movie The Boondock Saints at 7:30 p.m. or 7 p.m., according to data from Jake's phone. The clip was called Ding Dong Mother. I've seen the movie. It's the story of two brothers who are vigilante killers, and they say scripture over the people they've just murdered, and their dad joins in. One of the two brothers was played by Norman Reedus. Y'all, Jake thought he looked like Norman Reedus. That's a big nope. Lord have mercy. So apparently he thought he was his doppelganger, or however you say it. Oh boy. Nice try. So one of the brothers in the movie also has a 1911 22 gun with silencers, which is what Jake used that night. Jake and George signed forged custody documents saying if anything happened to them, Angela would get custody. When it was time to go, they walked to the barn where the modified truck was out of sight, and they changed their clothes out there so they would not leave shoe prints going from the house out to the barn. They were dressed in all black and ski masks, and Billy drove the red dually truck that they had bought for the murder specifically. And Jake and George hid in the bed of that truck underneath that raised wood. So they arrive at Chris Sr.'s around 10:30 p.m. So Billy came to lower the gate for them. I'm thinking gate, we call that a tailgate. Yeah. They slithered out of the truck, and George got under that truck specifically, and Jake got under Chris Sr.'s truck and waited. As we know, Gary Rhoden was also there, one of the cousins. He frequently would live with Chris Sr., and so Billy and Chris Sr. go for a walk around that grow operation. So Chris and Gary walk back in front of the house in single file, and that's when George is supposed to shoot Chris Sr. with the SKS. That gun Jake did not like. George was taking too long and kind of seemed to be frozen from what Jake told prosecutors. And Jake didn't know if that fuel filter was blocking George's view because Jake said when he test fired that gun, it was an issue with him. So Jake said he took the gun from George, and at some point, Billy comes out and asks why they haven't shot. So Billy came up with a little lie of asking Chris Sr. to call his phone saying he had lost it. So at 10:55, Chris Sr. calls Billy's phone. That brings him to the front door so Jake could shoot him. So she said, we kind of know Chris's time of death right after that 10:55 call. He was in the doorway and was shot, and it forced the wood from the door into his skin, and it broke his arm. The bullet broke his arm. Billy was inside the house at this time. He shot Chris Sr. more, and he also shot and killed Gary. Gary was only shot in the head, and the shot knocked off his glasses and his ball cap. According to Jake, and this surprised me, I would not have expected this because I'm not going to lie to you. I look at Billy, he's a scary dude. Like, he just looks mean. Yeah, he just gives me the creeps. Billy ran out of the residence and was hysterical, saying, I just shot my best friend, and talks about the look Chris Sr. gave him when he realized what was happening. Wow. Can you imagine what Chris Sr. was thinking at that moment? Unbelievable. And you have to wonder, being in jail, I mean, does he ever think about it? Does he ever regret it? So, Jake and George tried to calm Billy down, and Jake went inside and got the keys he knew would be in Chris Sr.'s pocket that go to where the marijuana grow is. While he did that, Billy and George drugged the bodies of Chris Sr. and Gary into the back bedroom of Chris Sr. Jake knows this because the bodies had been moved when he came down. All right, so let's look at Chris Sr. I'm throwing these all up here. Excuse me. Chris Sr., he was 40 years old. He was one of the intended targets. As the patriarch, if they got rid of him, the structure of the family would fall. And also, if they only killed Hannah Mae, the true target, Chris Sr., would get them arrested or would retaliate. He had 8 gunshot wounds, 1 to the stomach, 1 to the chest, and 6 in the face. He also had defensive wounds. Gosh, the day of the murders, Chris Sr. worked at Big Bear Lake with his cousin Gary Rhoden, who was killed right there beside him. His last outgoing text was to Dana at 10:53, which is right before he calls Billy's phone. So, interesting. 10:55, that last outgoing contact on his phone was to Billy Wagner, which went to voicemail. As we know, his phone wasn't there. Chris Sr.'s phone was never recovered. So we have next Gary Rhoden. I'm going to throw this up here. Poor Kenneth didn't even get a slide. He is 38 years old. He was last seen at 8:30 p.m. by someone who was visiting Frankie and Hannah Gilley just next door. Gary had 4 gunshot wounds to the face. And the injuries to Chris Sr. and Gary shows they were fully awake when they were murdered. Probably the only 2 who are fully awake. Well, we know we found out a couple of people were awake, but not out of bed. So Chris was shot in the front door first, and that wood embedded in Chris Sr.'s face and head. And the prosecutor kind of estimates an AR or SKS was used in his murder. They also could tell the angle was from outside of the residence and someone positioned down from where he was shot. The phone jammer worked when they tested it, but the battery ran out really quickly and it didn't work long at all. So they took most everybody's phones except for a few. So they walk over after they've killed Chris Sr. and Gary, they walk over to Frankie's and it's locked. And that was a recent thing because Frankie's little boy Brentley was getting outside when he was staying with his daddy, opening the door, going outside, not safe. Responsible dad gets a chain light thing up high. And so with that, they decide to come back to Frankie's house later. They went back to Chris Sr.'s and decided to get into Chris Sr.'s truck to go to Dana's, his ex-wife or estranged wife. Dana had just moved into this residence about 30 days before. What they didn't know was Dana had worked a double shift at the nursing home and came home much later than usual. She wasn't home when they got there. Jake said to prosecutors in his confession Dana was not an intended target, but they didn't go inside just to kill Hannah Mae and little Chris when Dana wasn't there. So, yeah, she was an intended target. Instead, they drove down to Left Fork, which is where Kenneth's little trailer was, and they just drove by. So they go back to Chris Sr.'s, then they go to Frankie's. So Jake tried to pry open the door with a knife, but he said the tip of that broke off. Jake entered through an open window in the back of the trailer. Gosh, man, it is so scary, y'all. I'm sorry. Like, this is so freaky to me. He went to the back door and opened it so George and Billy could come in. So during the planning of all this, they were a little worried that Brentley might recognize Jake, even with a mask on. But Jake said Brentley was asleep on the couch when they came inside the house and the TV was on. So he went back to the bedroom where Frankie and Hannah Gilley would be sleeping, shot them both with the 1911 .22 gun. Frankie was a target because he knew Hannah complained about Jake's violence. Jake found this out when he spoke to his mom, Dana, the week of the homicides. I'm sorry, Jake found out when he spoke to Hannah's mom, Dana. Hannah Gilley was collateral damage, although she had 5 shots to the head and face, which is a lot more than some of the victims got. My theory on that is her brother is Charlie Gilley, who, Hannah dated and had a baby with. So it seems like maybe they took that out on her. I don't know. Just poor thing. Frankie, 9:30 p.m. He was last seen on surveillance at Rhoden. Is that how y'all say it in Ohio? Rhoden. First stop. He was getting groceries. 9:45 p.m. His last outgoing call was to Brentley's mom, Chelsea. And at 10:59 p.m., the last activity on his phone, y'all, took a picture of his 2 sons, Brentley and Ruger, sleeping. His phone was recovered, by the way. Hannah Gilley, she had, let's see here. I'm sorry. Did I say how many times Frankie was shot? Y'all. Y'all gonna be telling me to retire. Let's see here. I think Frankie. You got Frankie here. Oh, yeah. 2 shots to the head for Frankie. And then you have Hannah Gilley. 12:59 a.m., last phone activity. She called her sister. She had 5 shots to the head and face with a .22. They go back to Chris Sr.'s after murdering Frankie and Hannah Gilley to get his truck to drive to Dana's to get Chris Sr.'s so it wouldn't look suspicious. They waited for her to return home after she got off work. George and Billy entered the residence, and Billy had the .40 caliber gun, and George had the SKS. They kind of assumed little Chris would have a friend over. And also, Jake added that he wore the 10.5 shoe that night, and George wore the 11. That 11 size is almost exactly the same spot where Jake said George was stationed to be in case little Chris came out with a gun while Jake was killing Dana and Hannah. So they switched shoe sizes, wasn't their right size. Also, it was a super bloody crime scene, all of them. So there was blood. They found that print right where Jake said that George was standing that night. They cut that floor up actually and sent it in. Jake went into a hallway and positioned himself so he could see both Hannah and Dana. Dana was on the phone because he could see it was lighting up her face. She made a noise and he said it made him freeze. And the new baby started crying. This baby was 5 days old, by the way. He took 2 quick steps into Dana's room, shot her twice, and immediately went into Hannah Mae's room. He said Hannah Mae heard him because she was laying with her left side towards the doorway to look, and she had been nursing the new baby. He said he doesn't think that Hannah Mae recognized him, and he shot her. After he shot her, guys, this is so disgusting. But after he shot her, he rearranged her body on the bed so the baby could continue to nurse. He went back into Dana's room and shot her more times because she was making noises. He went out of the door into the kitchen, and when he opened the door, Billy had the .40 caliber weapon drawn, and George was still behind Billy guarding little Chris's room. Jake went into little Chris's room and shot him. Little Chris, I mean, if it's got to happen, thank goodness. He was asleep when he was killed. He was never awoken by the events that happened before he was murdered. They took the phones and got into Chris Sr.'s truck and drove back to Chris Sr.'s house. So you see Chris Sr.'s house is kind of the central place of where they're working out of. So Dana, why was she a target? Well, she knew things Jake had said about Hannah. And if she left with Sophia, he would kill her and bury her where her family could not find her body. And actually, Dana had confronted Jake about this. Dana was last seen on surveillance at Pebble's first stop and having a conversation with a coworker in the parking lot. So on the 22nd, that's going into the overnight hours. This started on the 21st. Now we're into the early morning hours at 3:32 a.m. There are a series of texts sent from Dana's phone to Chris Sr. that obviously go unanswered. Dana ultimately was shot 4 times in the head with a .22. Her phone was not recovered. Hannah Mae, the prosecutor said her crime was not returning Jake's love and not submitting to the demands of the Wagner family. I 100% just believe she didn't sign over custody. And that was, at that point, that was it. So on the 21st at 7 p.m., Hannah Mae drops newborn Kylie off at Corey Holderson's sister's house. That's the baby's daddy. And goes to Pike Hill Pond with her cousin and her cousin's boyfriend. 10 o'clock p.m., the last outgoing call was to Corey Holdren, who was supposed to stay with her that night, but his sister had some pipes to burst, so he wasn't able to. I mean, that's a stroke of luck. Ultimately, Hannah Mae had 2 shots to the head. Her phone was not recovered. All right, so Lil Chris. Prosecutors say he was one of the intended targets. So on the 20th, we're going back to a day before this starts. Little Chris, excuse me, had his car taken away by his mom because he broke curfew. He refuses to go to school for that week since he can't drive. And then on the 21st, the night the murders start at 8:30 p.m., Brett Hatfield sees little Chris working on a car at his dad, Chris Sr.'s house. At 11:50 p.m., the last outgoing contact from little Chris is a Snapchat to a girl named Brandy Taylor. Little Chris had 4 shots to the head with a .22. His phone was not recovered. So they drove back to Chris Sr.'s house and got the truck they purchased. Then the cars follow each other. Billy was driving Chris Sr.'s truck, and George was driving the murder truck. And they went to Left Fork. She says you're going to see this on surveillance. And there's a turnoff. And that's where George pulled off as if he's going to be a lookout or a getaway driver. And also, Kenneth had a sensor. He had the grow operation, just not as big as Chris Sr.'s. His daughter said if he had taken his blood pressure medicine, he would have been sacked out. Very heavy sleeper. And the door was unlocked. He only padlocked it from the outside when he left. Billy went inside. Jake said he saw a flash of light and then the .40 Glock was used. There were cameras to remove from that location due to the grow operation. And also they had to get a trail camera from a tree. Kenneth was shot once in the eye. I believe this is also the person that they scattered money at his feet. She forgot to put the graphic up today for Kenneth, just non-existent. But he was killed mainly because Chris Sr. had been hurt once by someone, and Kenneth retaliated for him. Also, he would know who killed him. So that's kind of why Kenneth was murdered. All right, real quick, we got to do our paid sponsor of the week, Gladskin. I love this stuff, y'all. I got like a bunch of products to try. I love shampoo bars. That's all I use. And then like these little blemish gel my kids love. So if you've been living with eczema, acne, rosacea, you can relate to the frustration of trying dozens of products over the years without any long-term relief. And with Gladskin, you can expect something different. While I haven't had to deal with eczema personally, my teenagers have been using this facial cleansing 3-part system. And I'm going to tell you guys what, it took like 2 days and it had improved drastically. They're lucky not to have it bad, but I was actually really surprised at the results. The shampoo bar is amazing. What I love is it doesn't leave any kind of film on your hair. As far as eczema, what actually causes the itchiness, redness, inflammation, and discomfort in the skin? It's a disruption of the bacterial environment, also called the skin microbiome. Gladskin specifically works to target the imbalance in your skin's microbiome. But unlike other skin brands and prescription medications, Gladskin uses microbalance, a revolutionary protein that restores the balance of the good and bad bacteria that live on your skin so it can finally heal. And is so effective that 91% of users, adults and children, they have a children line for eczema. We'll do that one tomorrow, who tried their top selling eczema cream reported a significant improvement in just 7 days. My great niece did, by the way, with this stuff. Gladskin eczema cream with milk microbalance is clinically proven to treat eczema itch, redness and irritation, and symptoms. So if you've been frustrated with your treatment options, don't wait to try Gladskin. They're offering my listeners 15% off plus free shipping on your first order at gladskin.com/whattheworld. That's gladskin.com/whattheworld for 15% off plus free shipping. Gladskin.com/whattheworld. Let's get back to this timeline. So after Kenneth's, they went back to Chris Sr.'s and got into the murder truck and went home. They parked that truck in the barn. They changed clothes, burned and tried to destroy the weapons and the firing pins. And they dug a hole in the barn and they buried something temporarily. I don't even know if she said what it was. Y'all, it was all over the place. I mean, these poor jurors tonight are probably like, who's who? I mean, it just was not laid out in any way. It took me hours, y'all, to get this in order. 6 years. Let's just hope things go a little smoother. Okay, so after Kenneth, they went back and tried to burn the weapons in the pins. They dug a hole in the barn. They disassembled the platform in that truck bed. And so what we know is Chris Sr., Kenneth, and Gary were shot with the same gun, a .40 caliber rifle. Frankie Dana, Little Chris, Hannah Gilley, and Hannah Mae were shot with a .22. The state says there were 3 weapons involved. And here's what's weird. Billy took the truck to his niece. And his niece is going to testify that Billy showed up with a truck even before the sun was up. That's the same night they murdered this whole family. She was super happy to have the truck, and it was titled in her name by the end of the day. His brother Bobby took Billy back to the farm, and when they arrived, Jake and George were outside the house and led them into the new barn where they were not destroying evidence, by the way, to look at a pig. He said he went inside the house with Jake, George, and Billy, just hanging out like nothing's up. And after the murders and after they had buried the items and burned other items, anything left over, they had 5-gallon buckets of concrete and dropped that stuff in 4 different buckets of concrete and made a goose box for their grandfather, Robert Wagner. And not only that, they gave it to him on Father's Day. Oh my gosh, 2016 Father's Day. Wow. Gave him concrete that had murder weapons in it. That was at the Flying W Farms. They floated it on the pond there and used the concrete buckets that had the murder weapons as anchors. So remember the goose box. And they fished there all the time. And so they were making a note. They saw this every time they went fishing. Ultimately the goose box sank because, ultimately, if no other reason, I'd say karma's a really good reason it sank. So Bobby Joe Manley comes to Chris Sr.'s property to feed his animals, which is something she does every morning. And he paid her $20 a day to do chores. So someone named Emma also went that morning, and also someone named Billy. So usually she gets there at 7:30, and Chris Sr. usually isn't there when they arrive. Normally he's on his way to work. He has 2 dogs, and he keeps those inside because they fight. I'm so sorry. My dog is having a meltdown, and I'm texting my son to come get the dog. So he keeps 2 dogs inside, but they have to be let out one at a time because they fight. And so on that morning, they knew something was up when they pulled up. And not only is Chris Sr.'s truck at the house, but the inside dogs who can't be let out together are sitting on the porch together. So Bobby goes to the house to see what's up, and the door is locked, which is unusual. So she gets Billy to get the key, and they go in. Not Billy Wagner. This is Billy, I believe, is Dana's brother. I'll have to verify that in a minute. They go in. She says there's furniture everywhere, and there are vice grips on the floor, which are normally in Chris Sr.'s pocket. And also there's lots of blood with drag marks from the living room through the kitchen, down the hall, into the bedroom. So she walks back to Chris Sr.'s bedroom and finds him and Gary dead on the floor, partially covered with a comforter. She yelled at them to see if they were alive, and Billy was behind her, so they leave. And Emma gets a phone, and Bobby Joe calls 911. Now, if you haven't heard it, I will stick that in the description here. You can hear it. It's very traumatic. She couldn't remember the address, had to walk to the mailbox to give it dispatch. She walks over to Frankie's house to get his help and let him know what's going on. She knocks. She's yelling, no answer. She hears Brentley answer from behind the door. And she says, "Hey, B, it's Aunt JoJo." He opened the door, and she actually had to help him with that chain lock. I've had to do that. Stick your hand up in there. She asked Brentley where his dad is. Brentley points and says, "Daddy has a lot of blood." So she goes in the bedroom and sees Frankie and Hannah murdered. Ruger had been nursing his dead mother and was covered in blood. So Bobby Joe takes Brentley and Ruger out of there and leaves. While she was walking to Frankie's, Billy got into the car, and they arrived to go get Dana Rhoden, who's been murdered, and also their parents, Leonard and Judy. By the way, Leonard Manley passed away before this trial happened. 6 years ago, we talk about the long road to justice. This case is the definition. He never saw one Wagner make it into a courtroom. So they stop at Dana's place and they yell, and there's no answer, but the door was open. So they go get Leonard and Judy, the parents. The parents follow Billy back to Frankie's, and they go in, and James Manley, who is the brother of Dana and Bobby Joe, he hadn't heard what was going on, but he saw Billy frantic at his parents' house, so he followed them. James went to tell Dana what happened to Frankie and Chris Sr., and he notices her door is open. So he opens the door and goes into the bedroom, and she was covered up. He felt around in the bed, felt her body. He lifted the pillow that was covering her face, and it was sticking, and he knew she was dead, and he left. Interesting that they covered certain people's faces. That's, to me, I've always heard that's a sign that a little bit of shame. These people have no shame, no soul, no nothing. But I wonder who wasn't covered and who was, as far as their face. He heard Kylie, the 5-day-old, crying, but he said he couldn't bring himself to go see anything more. So he went to the truck and got his wife, April, to tell her what he had seen, and she came back to Dana's with him. April and James were at Dana's. Law enforcement responds when Bobby walks out of Frankie's. So law enforcement wanted to protect those scenes, and law enforcement passed Dana's to go to Chris Sr. and Frankie's, and they see family outside those residences. So some family flags down the first law enforcement officers they see, and they told them they believed Dana was dead as well, and they heard a baby crying in her residence. They said Hannah Mae and little Chris should have been in that house as well. So law enforcement starts clearing the residences, not knowing if there's an active threat. Deputies go in to get the baby from Hannah Mae. They give that baby to an EMT, and April Manley was allowed to be with that 5-day-old. The first room they cleared was little Chris, and he was found dead in bed. Now, I had heard in the beginning they didn't find little Chris till much later in the day. And so this kind of contradicted that. In fact, at one point, very, very early on in that day, they couldn't find little Chris and thought maybe he had murdered his family. She didn't say there was a gap here of when they found him. So I don't know if that was a mistake on her part or if we've heard wrong in the past. So Hannah Mae, Dana, little Chris, all confirmed to be murdered. They clear the scene, rope it off. Now, Sheriff Reeder comes in at 9:30. The 911 call was just before 8 a.m. You'd think he'd have got there a little sooner. Of course, he's into pokey too. He's in prison for stuff. Wouldn't that be odd if him and Jake end up in the same pokey? He got a briefing and asked them to stage EMTs between Dana and Chris Sr.'s house. He calls BCI to help process the scene and to help with the investigation. So the Rhoden family calls Chelsea, which is Frankie's ex, and the mother of Brentley to come get him. All the kids are taken to the hospital to be checked out. Then more families arriving on scene to get information. And the sheriff decides to relocate the whole family to a church nearby. And they had been calling Kenneth Rhoden this whole time. And he worked in Columbus, and they knew he didn't check his phone except for on his lunch break. So they didn't really expect to hear anything from him until then, but he doesn't respond. So family leaves the church and goes to his little trailer to check. And cell service is terrible where he lives. He had no running water. He would go shower at Chris Sr.'s before work. Another family member, let's see, Donald Stone was there. That was a cousin. And also Kenneth's son, Luke, and another family member went inside the house. Luke called out for his dad with no answer, and Donald volunteered to go in and found Kenneth dead in his bed with one shot to the eye. And so they call 911. So she tells jurors they took them to an intersection and had them get out and showed them a home that had cameras. And then later she had them look at another one that went around the front. She then shows this photo with these dots all over it. And the red dots are for crime scenes and the purple are for cameras are located. And she said, you'll see one car and two cars following closely. I believe this is when they were going to and leaving Kenneth's residence. 1:30 p.m., they got search warrants to BCI agents. And also, coroners there don't do autopsies, but do respond when a death is unnatural. She said there's a dispute between Adams and Pike County about who had jurisdiction over this case. The sheriffs met, and she said this is still in dispute. But she said you'll hear from those who processed the crime scene and their assistants. They took photos starting from outside going in and took pictures before disturbing any of the evidence. And they start marking evidence and all those things. So crime scene number 1, she got this wrong initially. After lunch, she corrected herself, but this was Chris Sr. and Gary's crime scene. There was the 40 caliber casing that was lodged in the floor. And then the fully jacketed 32 ammo was there. And there was not enough left of the bullet to tell. Because she corrected herself and there wasn't enough of that they took out of the floor to do anything with. There were shoe prints collected, and the prosecutor said there was so much blood, they ended up and cut up part of that floor and sent it to the lab. The tech got 2 prints for comparison, and they have databases, and it's really cool. I've watched it. If you've seen Night Stalker, they show how they're able to put shoe prints in a database and scroll through and find a match for the most part, but the tech couldn't find a match. So she started going to stores locally to find a match and found it at Walmart. It was a men's Velcro shoe, and it was a 10.5 or 11. She found a 10.5 and an 11 inside the residence at Chris Sr.'s, a blood marking print. At Dana's, the identical shoe, size 11, was in the same spot Jake said George was standing in to watch for little Chris. The shoes were brand new, nothing was worn on the bottom. So after everything was secured, everyone who was there when the bodies were first discovered were taken and interviewed. They also took their shoes for comparison to rule them out. And the markings on the casings were unique. The 1911 Colt 22 long rifle left similar marks on the casings. So during the course of the investigation, they talked to someone in Germany and they verified that Colt made that and the firing pin made that unique marking. She said the coroner will tell you the injuries consistent with 5 victims was a 22 and felt it had to be a high-powered rifle and that a 40 caliber Chris Sr. was shot with. He was shot with 2 weapons, a high-powered rifle and a 40 Glock. Information came in the Rhodens had been in a dispute with another family, and some moron thought it would be okay to post on Facebook. He was responsible for these murders, but obviously it wasn't true. People are so stupid sometimes. Jake said George helped modify the truck, move bodies, sign custody documents, and would have shot little Chris if he'd have come out of his room. That's what he told prosecutors. She said, I neglected to tell you that before the silencer from the well had all the parts they purchased to make the silencer. She said that was a prototype that failed. They used fuel filters and made silencers for the SKS and the 1911. The 40 Glock did not have any silencers on it. So they show pictures of the guns. The SKS and the 1911 were never recovered. 3 weeks after the murders, Jake is interviewed. Early in the interview, he said everything was fine with him and Hannah, but Facebook messages and text messages said otherwise. Hannah confronted Jake about being violent with her. Billy was interviewed and they asked for all 4 of their phones, and he said he didn't have the phone he was using or he had the night of the murders. He said he kept trying to call his best friend, Chris Sr., and he was upset about the murders, so he broke his phone in frustration. Diabetes. He never tried calling. Chris Sr. tried calling Billy at 10:55 p.m. the night of the murders. We know that now. Also, Billy tried to throw somebody under the bus. So when he was being interviewed, he said they were supposed to do a big drug deal out of California for $800,000, and Skid Montgomery found out and said that, and Billy said that's who killed Chris Sr., and Billy said he was afraid he was next. So after focusing on the Wagners, they needed search warrants, and Jake had been dodging turning over his phone. So they served a search warrant right before the Wagners go to Alaska in May of 2017. And while serving the search warrant, the special agent noticed lots of shell casings in the driveway. So they got a search warrant for those in the event they were the same or similar to those at the crime scenes. The search warrant was executed the day after they left, the day they left for Alaska, and found a casing that was a match, fired from the same weapon from the 22 gun that was found at Frankie's and at Dana's. So the next day, more agents came and combed the area for more casings. They were weathered, but they ended up with 12 casing compared to the 6 casings they found at the crime scenes. They were all exact matches. So we know they moved to Alaska after the murders. There's a Daily Mail article where they had pictures of them in Alaska as if nothing was wrong. So the Wagners put all their belongings in trailers at the Flying W Farms. So what did investigators do? They get a search warrant for the trailers. Inside, they found a tub labeled important things. Inside that tub that said important things, ding, 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 was the receipt from April 7th, 2016 for 2 pair of shoes from Walmart. They were purchased 2 weeks before the murders. And also, to add insult to injury, they have Angela on video buying them. Oh, man. It's almost like I need to tell Scott Reich, these are your stupid criminals of the day. Also, in that tub, they found a typed list of demands about Sophia that she would be homeschooled. They said who could babysit her, and this was typed by Jake. So while in Alaska, Jake remarries this girl named Beth Ann. And Beth Ann ultimately echoed Tabitha and Hannah Mae's accounts of the Wagners being crazy controlling. Angela had put a tracker on Beth Ann's phone, also had hired a PI to look into her. And Jake also told her not to allow her family to know where she lived because he said, I don't want to have to kill someone. Now, the prosecutor said she made an oopsie. She said, Jake said, I don't want to have to kill someone else. And then she quickly had to correct herself. So George and Angela were mad at Jake because Jake told Sophia, his daughter, that she could call his new wife mom. So agents wanted to confront the Wagners with what they found, and agents went to the Canadian border and confronted them. They had a kind of a canned response about the bullets that they found. When confronted about the shoes, Angela admitted to buying them, saying they were grandpa shoes because the boys hated them. She threw them out that same day, so they couldn't have been used in the murders. Jake, George, and their kids were in the car when she bought those shoes, by the way. They installed a listening device at the border in their vehicles. The most interesting thing about that, they were surprised at the border when they were questioned. Agents put them in separate rooms. But when Billy gets in the car first, then Angela follows. Not a word about what just happened. Nothing like, oh my gosh, they think we did this. They think we killed them. Nothing. George and Jake get in the car. Later, we find out there's a reason they don't talk because Billy assumed the car was bugged. The laptop was seized at the border and in possession of Angela, but used by the whole family. Remember, they do everything together. They found where Angela had hacked into Tabitha and Tess's Facebook at the time when Tabitha had lawyered up to try to get rights to her son. Angela was looking for any dirt on Tabitha she could find in her private messages to use. So law enforcement also monitored their phone calls. In 2017, the recordings were reminding each other not to talk to one another on phones and wait until they get home. They would go outside to talk. They would not talk inside. They assumed everything was bugged. And when they really thought they were being listened to, they would just throw the conversation. So the most significant thing they heard in 2017 is they bought a ground penetrating radar. They took the victim's cells, but not Frankie and Hannah Gilley's. Jake was having conversations with the new homeowner at Peterson Road at this point, where they sold the residence, moved to Alaska. It was his first day of the new owners possessing the home. And, oh boy, can you imagine? First day, bam. Angela asked which barn they're searching because they have a search warrant and they're searching a barn over and over. Angela kept asking which barn are they searching. So they went to Alaska 2017, come back in 2018. They put listening devices in Jake and George's work truck because they did tandem driving, which normally it would be if Jake's driving, George is sleeping. They also served search warrants on Flying W Farms. They found 2 bulletproof vests in Billy's room and numerous weapons that were in his sister Robin's room. He told her to keep those in there in case of a search warrant. On Jake's phone, they found a list of guns Jake had made, including the SKS that belonged to George and the 1911 22 that belonged to Jake. So those were on the phone. And in 2018, more success of listening to conversations because they had kind of laid low while the Wagners were in Alaska. The conversations got more organic, and they tried to get a home loan in Missouri on their way back in from Alaska, but it didn't work out. So Angela's dad had passed, and they moved into his home. They found also on Jake's phone a picture of him holding a 1911 Colt 22 rifle. This is pretty cool. They took prints from the photos and known prints of Jake and confirmed it was, in fact, his hand holding that murder weapon. So they are arrested on November 13th, 2018 for the murders. In April last year, Jake comes forward and he gives a proffer, which means you testify, we agree to dismiss the death penalty. She said he will be here to testify and he has 8 life without parole sentences. The second part of that agreement was dismissal of the death penalty for the whole family if he testifies to their liking. So Jake led them to the murder weapons and they found the buckets and they chiseled out and soaked the concrete in oil and recovered parts of the gun used. Interestingly enough, the firing pin was not damaged, and the ballistics expert was able to fire them and make positive IDs of the SKS and the 40 Glock. Items found in the cistern that Jake led them to were homemade silencers, and it has a serial number, and they got that information from Maglite and said it was created in January of 2016, so it eliminated any prior owners. After Jake confessed, they made offers to the rest of them and said if anyone wanted to come forward and verify the consistency, it would be stronger corroborating evidence, and maybe they could get, a little deal too. She says Jake pled guilty to all 8, even though he only killed 5. He was complicit in it. And she says Angela plotted and planned to help execute the plan. She should have been held responsible for aggravated murder under the complicity theory, even though she didn't step a foot in those residences that night. To be complicit, you have to know murder was planned, help them commit these offenses. But as we know, Angela got 30 years and pled guilty to a lot of the aggravated robbery charges. So the last part of her insane openings is she just kind of reviews the charges and says this is why he's charged. Real quick, let's go through the defense because this is, let's see how long this is gone. Oh, an hour 5, y'all. Y'all are going to hate me. But we got to get through openings because testimony is going to be every day. So April 22nd, this is the defense. George Wagner lived on Peterson Road and he got up like a normal day, but there was one thing that was off. Jake was up before George. Normally, George's job was to feed the animals on the farm, but before he could feed the animals, he had to disassemble a woodshed close by his home. That's the one thing he had to do that day. Before George could leave, he noticed Jake was in the new barn alone on Peterson Road. George got ready and Jake joined him. And when they got there, George realizes he's forgotten his chainsaw. So they did as much as they could up to the point where they needed that chainsaw. And while headed back home to Peterson Road, Jake's cell phone goes off. And the caller was a guy named Andrew Carson, who said that he thought he was the first to tell Jake the mother of his child, Hannah, was dead, along with 6 other relatives. And the defense says Jake puts on an act worthy of an Academy Award. He wept and cried, and that's the first time George learned about the murders. Okay, listen. Okay, so let's just unpack that statement. That's the first time that George learned about the murders. You've got a confession that he was at every crime scene. Okay, look, don't say oh, wow, I had no clue. Say they threatened his life and he had to go. I mean, make it believable. Jesus. Oh my gosh, y'all. Okay, so the sheriff arrived at the scenes and asked for some help from BCI. And at the time, they had narrowed down their suspects, according to George's defense. BCI interviewed Jake 4 times. The first interview came just 3 weeks after the murders. They also thought it was important to interview Angela. They spoke to her on 4 occasions. Next, they talked to Billy and did so 3 times. On all those occasions, BCI came around asking for cells or to talk to them, but they never asked to talk to George, according to his attorney. He wasn't a suspect. George was talked to once, so BCI could plant a bug in his vehicle. That's what his defense said. George and his family were coming back from Alaska to talk to BCI, but they caught them at the border. They were not coming back to talk. Special agents had 4 rooms, and they talked to all 4. George had a special agent talking to him, and the interview was accusatory, but he backpedaled and said, your family has big problems. And he also said, do you want to be a witness or do you want to be a suspect? He said George knew his family had done bad things in the past, but never a crime of violence. He couldn't believe it. He denied knowing they were violent people. And the defense attorney says this isn't about Jake, Angela, or Billy. This is a trial about George. And I'm not going to spend 5 hours defending what they did. I mean, look, dude, kudos to you on that because I would have never got this out before 4 a.m. if you had. When you hear all of them or they did this, a red flag should raise. You're here to review the evidence against George. George can't help. He was born into the Wagner family, but that doesn't make him a murderer. There are 5 things I want you to pay attention to, he says. 1, what Jake says. He'll tell you George had nothing to do with the planning of these murders. George shot no one. George did nothing to destroy any evidence. Y'all, the words blending together. Glad we're almost done. The credibility of Angela and Jake, they're con artists and liars. Angela burned her home more than once in an act of arson to collect money from her insurance company. This started when George was 9, and Billy did the same with vehicles. Jake took their traits, and after Hannah's murder and the rest of her family, he set up a GoFundMe so that he could apply that to getting a lawyer to get full custody of Sophia. And this was very interesting, I have to say. Good point by him. He said they've conned the state of Ohio with the crimes she did. She got 30 years in prison. Jake gets life when they both should get death. He said it's the most remarkable plea deal possible, and I completely agree. 30 years should have never, it should have been life. Number 3, the incentives offered by the state to Angela and Jake to testify. Number 4, motive. He says custody is not it. Angela's delusions that Sophia was being molested. Jake was jealous and abusive to Hannah and couldn't stand that Hannah had moved on. Angela convinced him Sophia was at risk of abuse and Billy was engaged in drugs. The drug activity is rife in this case. George had no motive. Number 5, how different George is from his family, you're going to see. Jake told Agent Shiver that George had nothing to do with this plan. It was me and my dad. Billy decided when it would happen, what we would use, and how it would be done. He said nothing about a vote. Remember, they said they took a vote around the kitchen table. That's how they always came to a decision. Billy told Angela what tasks had to be done to commit the murders, but no evidence. He told George to do anything to prepare for the murders. Billy decided the day George wasn't supposed to go. Billy picked the day a drug deal was supposed to happen. George had nothing to do with drugs, and Billy told Jake to get a vehicle to be used in the murders. Jake will tell you he made the suppressor himself. Then this hair, the coloring of the hair. Jake said he colored his hair, but the key witness will say it had nothing to do with the murder. And he watched Boondock Saints, not George. The burned DVD was destroyed, so stolen vehicles wouldn't be seen going on or off the property. The task for Angela was to acquire shoes. Billy asked her to acquire a cell jammer and a bug detector. And the last task is Billy told Jake to destroy the evidence. There's no physical evidence George was there, no DNA, no prints, and he had no motive. So to avoid death, they must implicate George. Angela said when they went to kill, she fell asleep and woke up the next morning and nothing was ever discussed. So this means she can't contradict what Jake has said. He says, yes, in Jake's confession, there was evidence gained, but we think the evidence will show Jake killed all 8 victims, but had to implicate his dad. Interesting. Frankie was one of George's closest friends, and Hannah Mae was like a little sister to George. He is not like his family. He disagreed with their lifestyle so much he had fistfights with his dad. As soon as he got his driver's license, he ran away at 16. He had to come back home, but he avoided it as much as he could. George and Tammy, or I'm going back and forth between George and Tabby have a son who's George's world. They got married young. Her mom offered to get her an attorney to fight for custody, and Tabby said no. She read the agreement George gave her and signed it, and she also agreed to a judge that she agreed to this settlement. The BCI agent said George did things right with his kid going through the courts, and he doesn't go along with them. And he says the evidence is going to show George didn't kill anybody that night. So that's it. That's it. Defense was way more fine-tuned, just made the point, trying to explain all of this ballistic evidence and all this stuff and openings that was hours and hours and hours. If the jury truly doesn't know much about these victims and how everybody's connected, man, the prosecution's got a hill to climb to kind of reel them in and get a foundation laid that they can build and learn from. Because I'm going to tell you, I was confused about 5 times. I've been sitting here since 5 o'clock. I've been confused 50 times. So they need to reel it in. All right, guys, I'm going to watch testimony tomorrow as best I can. The kittens are getting neutered. Thank goodness. Maybe it'll calm them down. Also, my son has a cross-country meet, so I have to go 30 minutes away from home to watch that priority. But I should be able to watch a good bit during the day. The episode may be a little later tonight. Or tomorrow night. Sorry about that. But also, I hope you like the new intro and outro. Played around with that this weekend, and I'm going to mess with this screen a bit. I'm just trying to do some new things to liven it up a bit and make it look a little more professional. All right, guys, see you tomorrow.